Hey y'all, howdy. Welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandy Broadwell, and today we're going to do the Where My Lore Started tag. This tag was just created by Carrie Can Read, so I will link her original video down below. There are 12 questions in this tag, and Carrie specifically said that we could add on to the tag and change it as much as we wanted. She had one question that I am going to discard and add in a question of my own, but I will have all the original tag questions down below if you would like to do it for yourself. So Where My Lore Started is a social media trend right now where people just talk about like what was the media that influenced them as a kid. This is obviously focused on books, so we're going to be talking about some deep nostalgia today. Question number 1 is, what's the first book you remember reading by yourself? I don't have a specific memory of like the first book I read by myself. My parents read to me all the time. I was a voracious reader from as far back as I can remember. So I have no specific like memory of like the first book that I ever read by myself. So I thought I would just take this opportunity to talk about some picture books that I really loved when I was a kid. The big ones that stand out probably for a lot of different people in my generation, there was of course the Berenstain Bears, Little Critter books, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie or If You Give a Moose a Muffin, that whole little series. Also want to give a shout out to The Paper Bag Princess, probably the first ever like feminist media that I consumed. Such a great story, classic to this day. The monster at the end of this book was an absolute favorite of mine because my dad would read it to me in his Grover voice. But even after I started reading for myself, I read that book over and over and over again. And then there is a book called Put Me in the Zoo that I always thought was a Dr. Seuss book, but when I looked it up today, found out it is not. But I really loved that book. It had some great messages in it about identity. And then 2 books that I really loved as a kid that I don't remember a lot of other people talking about or reading at the time was Plant Pet, which was sort of like a Giving Tree-esque story, except that the plant could like walk around, and I just loved the animation's not the right word. The illustrations in that book were so captivating to me, and I loved the idea of like a sentient plant pet. And then the other one that I remember reading a whole bunch was Harvey Potter's Balloon Farm. The illustrations in that book just totally captured my imagination. It was a very weird little story about a strange man. He grows balloons on his farm. It was just a magical read that I read over and over and over again. So those are just some picture books that stand out to me from my childhood. Question number 2 is, what character did you most identify with in elementary school? I don't know that I ever super identified with a ton of characters when I was younger, but I will say that I really loved Hermione in the Harry Potter books. She was smart and brave, and she had a lot of friends, and so I loved Hermione. I also really loved Sam from, and I did not remember Sam's name, but the story My Side of the Mountain was one that I absolutely adored when I was growing up. It's about a young boy that like goes off to live in the wilderness by himself, and he like befriends a hawk and some other creatures, and he like lives inside of a hollow tree. And I just thought that story was so magical. I wanted to escape and live out in the wilderness by myself too. And so if you could like combine maybe Hermione with Sam from My Side of the Mountain, I really loved both of those characters. Totally unrealistic story about, you know, like a 10 or 12-year-old like roughing it and living for months by themselves through the winter, but you never know. Question number 3 is, what was your elementary school comfort book? I had so many books and series that were comfort reads for me. My brother and I loved the Garfield comics. We had books and books of Garfield comics that we read over and over and over again. When I got a little older, that transitioned for me into Calvin and Hobbes. I had like 12 or 13 different Calvin and Hobbes books that I would read relentlessly. I don't know if that was probably more middle school time, but back to elementary school, I loved the Holiday Inn series, which was about a family of animals. There was like a cat, a dog, and a bunny. Bunnicula is the most popular, like most well-known book in that series, but there was like multiple books that you could read in that series about the same family of animals, and I loved that series. And then really just like any series I feel like that had endless books that you could choose from was popular, because like they were just comfort reads because you knew what you were getting into. I think when I was in elementary school, there was like choose your own adventure books. There was the Babysitter's Club. There was Goosebumps. There was Wayside School, the Boxcar Children. There was some like, I remember more like mystery detective type stories like Encyclopedia Brown and Hank the Cowdog. I know a lot of people when they were kids read like Nancy Drew or the Hardy Boys. I never really got into either of those, but I did read the Bobbsey Twins, which is basically the same thing, except instead of like Nancy Drew or the Hardy Boys, it was like two sets of twins that were, all four of them were siblings, and they solved mysteries. I loved the Bailey School Kids, which had all these like ridiculous covers and titles like Vampires Don't Wear Polka Dots and Leprechauns Don't Play Basketball or whatever. My brother loved a series called Aliens Ate My Homework, and so he owned those, so I read those multiple times. Those were great. Anything by Roald Dahl or Beverly Cleary, comfort reads for sure. So those were all like just series that either continued enough that you could read a new book like every week and there was always more to read, or they were just like easily rereadable. So question number 4, the original tag question was where or what was a safe space for you as a kid? I don't feel that question is super relevant, so I am changing it to what was the first book you remember that made you cry? And for me, I distinctly remember Where the Red Fern Grows. I read in 4th grade and was devastated. So if you've read Where the Red Fern Grows, I'm sure you have a similar experience. But that's the first book I ever really remember reading and crying over. That did it for me. There may have been others before that, but again, that was the first one that like made a core memory. Question number 5 is how have your tastes changed since childhood? And I will say they haven't really changed very much. I still love fantasy and sci-fi, which I loved as a kid. I still love survival stories. I will say I probably read less mysteries type stories. I probably read a little less thrillers, but for the most part, I'm still reading the same sorts of stories, scratch my itches now that they did back then. Question number 6 is, did you feel inspired to read by your school? And if yes, how did your upbringing encourage reading? Yes, I did feel inspired to read by my school, but I have to say first that I was very inspired to read by my parents. My mom is a big reader. I always saw her reading when I was growing up, and so she, of course, modeled that behavior. My dad isn't so much of a reader, but he still encouraged us to read. He read to us all the time, and we had a 9 o'clock bedtime when I was a young kid, but if we were in bed, pajamas on, teeth brushed by 9 o'clock, then we could actually stay up till 9:30 as long as we were in bed reading. And so it was like a special treat that we got to like stay up late to read our books. So that was like a great way that my parents encouraged us to read, because we felt like we were like cheating bedtime, but really they were just getting us to read more, which was a fantastic parenting tactic that I encourage any parents who are watching to steal. But as far as like how my school inspired me to read, I think I took my love of reading into school. I loved reading before I even really got to school. But when I was in 4th grade, we moved to Kentucky, and Kentucky had a program called AR, which stood for Accelerated Reader Program. And basically, with the AR program, every book was assigned a number of points based on how difficult it was, and you could take tests online that asked you like reading comprehension questions about the story, and then if, based on how you did on the test, you got the number of points for the book. I was way behind on AR. They did, my elementary school did like cumulative AR points from like kindergarten through 6th grade. And so when I moved from a different state, I did not have any AR points as a 4th grader. And by the time I graduated elementary school in 6th grade, I was like the 3rd highest AR kid in the entire school. So I like got a big like special day or whatever for being like a top reader in my school. I also remember before I ever moved to Kentucky and when I lived in Indiana, they had a young writers program, which I know writing and reading aren't the same thing, or a young authors program, I should say. But they encourage us to write stories, and that also, I think, fueled my love of stories and reading and writing. And then of course, scholastic book fairs were a huge thing for me when I was a kid. I was lucky enough to have parents that provided me with like, $10 or whatever every time there was a scholastic book fair. And so I really looked forward to those days at school. I also remember like my local public library having like summer reading programs, and there was like something to do with Pizza Hut. Pizza Hut had like a young readers program where you read so many books over the summer and got like a free personal pan pizza or something. So yeah, I feel like there was lots of great programs like that when I was a kid. And I hope those things still exist. Question number 7 is, what book have you wanted to return to lately? I guess a book from my childhood. And I remember probably when I was in middle school. Let me Google when this came out, actually. So it says it was the first book was published in 1998. So I would have been 8 years old. I don't think I discovered it that year. I feel like maybe it was like 2 or 3 years later when I discovered the book is Green Rider by Kristen Britton. And I instantly was captivated by this book as a kid. It's one of the only books I can really remember from my childhood that had a female protagonist in like a fantasy setting or like an epic adventure type setting. That feels really rare from what I remember in childhood. And I loved her I don't even remember the main character's name, but I loved her. I loved the story. It was so like lush and imaginative, and I feel like that story still inspires me, but I really remember very little about it. I feel like the vibes in that book are immaculate. And I remember when I read the first one, I was like so excited to continue the series. But at the time that I started reading it, only like maybe 2 of the books were out. And by the time like the next book came out in the series, I like had forgotten about it or didn't realize that the next book came out or whatever. It just fell off my radar. But even still to this day, I remember like just being totally transported by the Green Rider series. And I have recently learned, or recently like came to my attention that this series still exists and possibly is still ongoing. And there's like a bajillion books in the series now. Let me see what Goodreads says. The first book has a 4.09 rating on Goodreads. It looks like there are 7 books in the series now. The most recent one was published in 2021. So wow, like to start a series in 1998 and to like still be publishing it in 2021. That's wild. I'm not sure if it's complete or not, but all of the books in this series, except for it looks like book 5, have like a high 4 rating. So I would love to return to this series and remember, I guess, what I loved about it so much and see if it's something for me as an adult, because I remember it being incredible, but I can't really tell you why. So that's one that I would love to try again. Okay, number 8 is your favorite or formative YA series. Of course, I am a millennial. Harry Potter was so huge for me formatively as a young person. I think the first book came out when I was like 8 years old maybe, but it wasn't until like the second or third book came out that I was actually clued into the series. And then I was the same age as Harry Potter when I started reading the Harry Potter books. I think he turns 11 in the first book, and that's how old I was when I read the first book. And then every year that the books came out, because for a while they were coming out once a year, and I was the same age as Harry Potter in every single book. So that was obviously extremely formative experience for me and everyone else in my generation. It's a shame the way things are now, but can't deny that Harry Potter was a huge part of my childhood. I also remember I was in middle school when Aragon came out, and it was a fantasy series that had a dragon on the cover. I was definitely going to read it and did. Also in middle school, I remember getting really into the Shannara series. I think that The Sword of Shannara is the first one. I don't know how many of those books I read. I feel like there's infinite numbers of them, but I know I probably at least read like 10 11, 12 of them. I read a lot of Shannara books, which is more of like a classic fantasy series. And then middle school was really when I remember getting my first like really formative sci-fi experiences. I read the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series, fell in love with that. I've reread it multiple times since then. I read the Ender's Game series by Orson Scott Card and the Ender's Shadow companion series. Those were mind-blowing to me at the time. I don't even know if that's a young adult or middle grade series or not, but I feel like those would be very rereadable as an adult, because I'm sure some of the concepts at the time just like blew right past me. And then in middle school, I also just remember reading a lot of like big thriller type authors like Michael Crichton and John Grisham and Dean Koontz and stuff like that. My mom read a lot of that kind of stuff, and so there was always those sorts of books around the house, and I ate that up. So I read a lot less of that kind of stuff now, but I still really enjoy those sorts of books and have a lot of nostalgia for them. Oh, and then another, not that this is a series, but a book that was hugely impactful to me when I was a young person was The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. That book, still to this day, I think is so powerful and so meaningful and really, really made a huge impression on me. I highly recommend reading The Outsiders if you haven't ever. Okay, question number 9 is a book that you had to read in school but loved. The first ones that come to mind are way back in 6th grade. My teacher was Miss Bevel. She was great. And we read 2 books in her class that I loved and still love, and that was Holes and The Giver. Great books. I will say one book that I probably would have liked if it wasn't a required school read was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but we ended up reading that in like 3 different grades as I was going up through school. And I was like, why aren't these teachers communicating with each other? We have already read this book. And by the 3rd time, I was like, are you kidding me? I'm so tired of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So that was a huge turnoff for me of the entire Narnia series, unfortunately, because I do know that that is a good book objectively. Let's see. And then moving on to like high school, we read To Kill a Mockingbird, which I really, really loved. We read The Fall of the House of Usher and The Telltale Heart and Others by Edgar Allan Poe. I loved Edgar Allan Poe when I was in high school. And then I just want to give a shout out to Mr. Crosslin, who was my junior year English teacher. I didn't really love any of the things that I read in his class, but I loved reading them as a part of his class. He made them interesting. The discussions we had around them were so interesting, even though they weren't the types of stories that I would have gravitated towards. So I'll just do a run through real quick because I still remember like all the things that we read in his class. We read The Crucible, The Scarlet Letter, The Great Gatsby, Huck Finn, Death of a Salesman, Macbeth. Really like a ton of classic formative reads for me that, again, I didn't necessarily enjoy, but I loved the experience of reading them together with his class. So thanks, Mr. Crosslin. Question number 10 is your weirdest favorite book. I can't really think of any like super weird books that I was into. I will say once I got into high school, my reading level was always like way above what my grade was at the time, but in high school I fell in love with Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, and then I got really into Kurt Vonnegut. I don't know any other high schoolers at the time that were reading Kurt Vonnegut, and I won't say Slaughterhouse-Five isn't necessarily a weird, but it's kind of weird, but like a lot of Kurt Vonnegut's other stuff is like super weird and out there, and I ate it up. I was a Vonnegut stan, and I still love Kurt Vonnegut. Number 11 is, if your 13-year-old self could live in a fictional world, which would it be? And is it different from the world you choose now? 13-year-old me, hands down, would have chosen Hogwarts. Like, it's not even a contest. I was obsessed with Harry Potter, with Hogwarts, with a magical academy idea. Nowadays, I would not choose that. Nowadays, I feel like Star Trek is sounding really good. Just because Star Trek is one of the few like fictional worlds I can think of that has a hopeful view of the future of humanity, and things are just really bad in the world right now, or in my country specifically, and so I feel like I could use a lot more hope. And Star Trek is a great one for that. So yeah, I love the thought that in the future we'll be a united planet, a united humanity, and be the peacemakers in the universe. That'd be great. The last question, number 12, is there a newly released book you wished you had had when you were younger? And I'm sure the answer to this is yes. I have not read any YA books in years, like over a decade, I'm sure. There are lots of YA books that I hear about that sound really appealing. So I'm positive I'll just flash up YA books that I kind of like hear about that I think I would really enjoy if I read today. But I have not dipped my toe in the YA world in a very, very long time. But I will say, going into other forms of media, She-Ra and the Princesses of Power on Netflix is absolutely one of the best pieces of media I have ever seen. And I feel a lot like people who talk about like Avatar: The Last Airbender, who like maybe grew up with that show, but like you rewatch it as an adult and it's still so good. I just watched She-Ra and the Princesses of Power for the first time as an adult, obviously, because it came out when I was already an adult. That show is so good. All of the main characters are women or young women, and there's so much great representation, and it really has like so many great messages. It's so uplifting, it's so empowering, but it really dives into like a lot of hard topics, and it gets really dark, but there's like cool magic. It's like sci fantasy. If that series had been around when I was a kid, I would have been obsessed. No, I am obsessed. If it would have been my whole personality though. Like if I had seen that show when I was a kid, I really wish something like that had existed for me. So I'm glad that it exists for today's generation. Anywho, go watch She-Ra and the Princesses of Power if you haven't seen it. It's so good. I will say not every episode is good, but every season is a fantastic arc that is complete, and the 5 seasons of the show overall is a complete arc that just, oh my god, it's awesome. Okay, enough about She-Ra. So that's the end of the book tag. Let me know down in the comments below what some of your answers are to these questions. I would love to hear what nostalgic reads that you want to reflect on. And thanks so much for tuning in and hanging out with me for a little bit today. As always, please be kind, read more books, and hit the subscribe button down below for more bookish content to come. I'll see you soon.